SoccerX Connected, day 4, and Jacobs with you. Brought to you by Teamworks. We'll hear more from them in just a moment. Our theme is commercial marketing and broadcast. We're giving away a signed shirt as well. We've done this all week. So if you'd like to be in the mix to win that, all you've got to tell us, because our presenting partner today is Teamworks, is which two players simply work together. That might be from your current club. You could go back in history or get creative and pick two players that actually haven't played together but would make good teammates. Thanks to Ollie Slape, who's been in contact via Twitter. That's at SoccerX for me. The best two teammates are Rooney and Ronaldo at Manchester United. Look at what they achieved together and the connection they forged. And Ross Auer says it was a joy to watch Zidane and Ronaldo, the R9 Ronaldo, the Brazilian, of course, during their time together at Real Madrid. Hashtag SoccerX Connected if you would like to enter. Once again, all I need from you is two players that just work together, whether they are fictional and never actually played together. Maybe you play Championship Manager or Football Manager, one of those online games, and you've signed two players that work together. Perhaps you want to take two players from different eras, or maybe just give me two players from your current team that work well together. At SoccerX, hashtag SoccerX Connected, please. Right, let's move on to our 1 o'clock GMT panel. As I say, the theme today is commercial marketing and broadcast, and this is entitled On the Same Page, Improving Athlete Welfare Through Team Communication. And effective communication is naturally the backbone of operational efficiency, and that in turn improves athlete welfare both on and off the field. Internal communication strategies have changed dramatically over the course of the last year or so, partially because of COVID-19, but also leaning on new technology in order to fill information gaps and sustain team culture and morale. So have all of these strategic changes set the stage for a new standard of team communication? To discuss, we're delighted to welcome back one of our speakers from yesterday, Mike Jacobs, the GM of Nashville. Alongside him, we have Sam Zapatka, the men's national team administrator at the United States Soccer Federation. Connor Barry is representing Wolverhampton Wanderers. Good win for them against Arsenal a few days ago. He's the deputy head of football administration. And your moderator is from our presenting partner of the day, that is Teamworks, and their president of global market is Mitch Heath. Mitch, it's over to you.
All right, thank you, Ben. Well, I appreciate everyone at SoccerX and all the work done to coordinate and put together this opportunity to talk with the audience today. Especially appreciate our three expert panelists here and their willingness to weigh in on a critical but often overlooked topic, communication. When we look at teams across the world, clubs at the elite level all the way down to the youth level, right behind their operation is how well they communicate together, how well they stay on the same page. And so that's what we want to dive into today. Connor, I'm going to kick it off with you if that's all right. Let's talk about the last year. It's been a crazy year. There have been a lot of new constraints imposed. And, I think you'd all agree that communication has been essential throughout the history of sport. But when we look at this period of constraints, but also innovations, talk about how you've handled that from a team comms perspective and maybe some of the new innovations that have come about as a result of the kind of changing world dynamic.
Yeah, sure. No, it has been a crazy year, and as everyone else has had to adapt to the situation, football clubs have done the same as we have. So kind of at the start of the pandemic, when we realised that the season was going to be curtailed and players were going to go off and not be able to come into the training grounds, we created what we call the team bubble, which was just the first team players, the first team coaching staff, and any key members of organisational staff. So once we created that bubble, I would say that the maximum amount is around 90 people within that bubble. We then began to kind of communicate through each other regarding key important factors throughout the situation. So it was key updates throughout the pandemic, whether it be the new rules coming out from the government on what players could do and can't do, whether it be information coming from the Premier League in terms of when the season will be up and running again, when we can start training. So that kind of bubble was hugely important for us in terms of creating that and being able to communicate effectively with our players and making sure they were kind of keeping up to date with fitness schedules and things like that. So yeah, that was one of the key things we did at the start of the pandemic, and I believe that's definitely something we'll maintain throughout once this is over, is maintaining that bubble of those key people to communicate effectively. So and it's definitely proved effective so far.
Great. Sam, being at U.S. Soccer, you've got a large geography to cover and don't always have the luxury of a co-located bubble. How have you dealt with kind of the challenges of folks being spread out? And similar question, any innovations that you want to make sure stick around post-pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. And to piggyback a little bit off of what Connor said, very similar to what we did. We immediately created a group chat communication. We have players throughout the entire world, so definitely need to take into account the time differences when we are sending messages. But that involved all of our technical staff, our organization staff, and then a variety of our players throughout the world, and just continuing to update them on what's going on from a federation level, how we're dealing with the pandemic. A lot of it was our return to play protocols and our manual that we were working on to allow for a safe and healthy return, and to create an environment where they felt comfortable coming in. This happened right before one of our March window dates, and then we returned to play in November in Europe. So throughout that entire time, we were just constantly in communication with all the guys, something that we've continued on in this group chat. And it's kind of been something that's been fun as well. Guys are telling jokes, and we're from all the different leagues. It's just a huge support system. Guys are congratulating each other on MLS, Premier League, all those different types of things. So it's been really, really great, and we'll continue to do that.
And Mike in Nashville, both of these guys have talked about just the transparency needed, the extra information needed. Even just to reduce anxieties when things are uncertain. How have you guys managed that with your players?
This pandemic has changed how all of us do business, probably forever. And, good or bad, right or wrong, to have to deal with, a global pandemic or catastrophe like this, I think it tests your mettle about not only what kind of leader you are, but how effective a communicator you are as a group. And, when you have at times staff working remote, the idea of regular, steady contact, whether it's through Zoom calls or emails, whether it's through WhatsApp groups or using platforms like Teamworks, I think it created opportunities for us to keep everybody not like LinkedIn and connected, but it kept everyone to kind of feel like that they were included, that there was an inclusive process, and and keeping everybody engaged is really important. And both Connor and Sam talked about being in bubbles. When we were in Orlando for the MLS is Back tournament, not only were we in that figurative bubble down there with MLS, but, due to a mass quarantine, we had to withdraw from the tournament. And, even though we weren't able to play, our players were quarantined, and in some cases isolated for almost 2 weeks. So, we tried to do daily was to have daily Zoom calls with the players and staff. And what I really appreciated was, I had one of our senior players referenced to me that even when I had nothing to share, making sure that they saw my face, as the leader of our group, one, trying to show stability and maintain, that things were okay, but also to make sure that they felt that they were all involved in the process, that they felt that they were as connected as they could be via satellite.
Excellent. Yeah, and we talk a lot with teams that we work with about that frequency of communication, and like you said, even when there's not a critical update, just making sure, hey, we're on track, we're here, you see us, we're visible, we're in communication. Mike, I want to stick with you and ask a quick follow-up. We've, when we talk about communication and club comms in particular, people often think about players to coaches, players to staff. But from your seat as an executive in Nashville, talk about how communication works effectively, both from you to the whole organization and for staff members and players communicating up to your seat and giving you the visibility and information you need.
Well, I guess first off, from me, I have we have 8 different departments in the sporting side of our club, and we meet and talk daily with our department heads, and we talk a lot about sometimes the dissemination of information. When is it appropriate to come from your department head to the staff? and when is it important to come from the chief executive, sporting director, or general manager. And for me, I try to take a really global look at the idea of our guiding principles for our club. And what I think tried to adopt during the course of the pandemic was a lot of storytelling. At least once a week, whether it was an email or a Zoom call, in some ways maybe trying to call out somebody for not necessarily doing something poor, because so often you think about negative reinforcement. When people are called out, it's for making a mistake. So often during a pandemic, we try to kind of call somebody out for not only doing something well, but for their ability to adopt maybe one of our guiding principles or a mission. Because I think it helped kind of tell a story from the standpoint of, by following these guiding principles, you're going to find success whether you're together or remote. And, I think by doing that, not only did it help tie maybe like the NSC way, which is our guiding principles, with our staff, but it also, I think, developed good buy-in from the fact that we were acknowledging things people were doing, whether we were all together or, apart via satellite.
Mm-hmm. And, Sam, as you hear that, I think about, in your seat as operating a national team, you've got a whole extra layer of stakeholders beyond the players and staff that you're communicating with. How have you managed keeping some of those maybe next tier parties or executive parties informed?
Yeah, and I think going back to what Mike said, a lot of it is just engagement, right, and constant communication, and like you said, we've seen what communication works and what doesn't work, especially in this pandemic, and just the constant engagement of what are we doing moving forward. One of our guiding principles for our men's national team is have a plan, make a better plan, and I don't think that could be more important in our line of work now. And it's a constant Zoom call, email, text message, anything to say, hey, listen, things have changed. This is what we're doing, but we're still overseeing everything with the forefront being what our values are and how we're going to achieve these goals.
Yeah, and I love, as I'm hearing you guys, this kind of balance you're striking between core values and staying true to who we are and the culture we want to build, while at the same time making sure we have really efficient operational communication, really strong visibility. Sam, something you said in your previous answer was that you wanted to make those group chats fun, and it wasn't just logistics, it was also team building, morale building. Connor, I'd love to hear how you struck that balance at Wolverhampton of, again, visibility, operations, but fun, team culture, team morale.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was massively important to make sure the players' morale was always up and high and boosted, and making sure things at home were great for them, and that constant communication was great in terms of, so some of the key kind of components we used were just feel good stories, circulating feel good stories to the players that will make them feel great. So whether that be a player, a new birth of a player's child, so putting that out there on a group chat and getting the congratulations. Or a good example was so the Premier League set up a FIFA tournament for all, one player from every Premier League team throughout the pandemic, and there was a tournament, so a knockout tournament, and thankfully for us, we had at the time Diogo Jota played for us, who was a very good FIFA player, and he got all the way to the final. And what we would do is we would put the videos out there on the group chat for the whole club to see, watch him play in the games. Even though there was no games on the TV at the moment, it was actually good for the players to see their own player participating in a FIFA tournament. And then off the back of that, there was obviously a lot of good banter and congratulations when he actually he beat Trent Alexander-Arnold in the final of the FIFA tournament. So just things like that help boost the morale and keep things high in a difficult time.
Excellent. And that raises a point to me that's been on my mind recently, and I'll pitch this to all three of you guys. Players naturally, and staff as well, coaches, have a concern with privacy, as they should, right? They're high profile individuals. Some are prolific on social media. Some like to keep more of a private life. Obviously, as teams, you guys have information on players that you don't want getting out to the general public, or, parties that shouldn't have their eyes on certain information. As you've increased communication, as you've spun up group chats, as you've, tried to share pictures of family members and new children being born to increase morale, how have you balanced the need for extra communication with the need for continued privacy and security of information. And maybe Connor, I'll stay with you, then we'll go to you, Mike, and then you, Sam, if that works.
Sure. It's just keeping kind of that bubble to the relevant people, and not expanding that to extra parties that don't necessarily need that information. So whatever we're circulating, just making sure if it's private and confidential, it's remaining within that group and it doesn't go externally. And then there's obviously softwares and apps that we use to make sure any private information doesn't get kind of exposed externally. So we make sure we do everything we can to make sure the players' privacy and security is one of the key priorities throughout.
Mike, anything new you've introduced or different approaches to player privacy?
What was interesting during the pandemic was, Connor mentioned earlier, fans watching FIFA games because there are no matches on television. And, what I appreciated on, the commercial side of the club was how do you engage fans at a time when there's no matches on Saturdays, So absolutely can appreciate trying to have our players be that much more thoughtful and mindful about sharing things that they can do. And, I know Sam's got a number of players with the senior men's team. One of ours, Walker Zimmerman, who plays with them, is very active not only on social media but also with gaming. And I think fans want to be able to see how human the players are, and I think to be able to see guys like Walker Zimmerman or Christian Roldan play video games together, for fans to be able to get some insight into how players are coping with a global pandemic, whether it's things they do at home with their families or their pets, workouts that they're doing, be able to share stuff like that. I think there's got to be a balance that you strike with being able to relate to the fans and keep them engaged, being able to show how human the players are and how they're coping with something like that, while also maintaining their privacy. And, for us, another point Connor mentioned, I think looking at when we're disseminating information as a group, who has to be, on those, Teamworks emails or Zoom phone calls, and then looking at, who's comfortable, independent of that, with sharing some of the things that they do in their own time.
And Sam, for you, and an additional challenge for U.S. Soccer, thinking about youth players, right? Folks that are minors that have parent communications involved. Anything different you've done to handle privacy?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think one important note that Mike and Connor both brought up was the fan engagement part. And a lot of these guys want to see, how real these guys are and what they're cooking and what they're doing for their morning routine, what kind of coffee they make. And for the youth side, what we've really tried to do as well is engage them with some of our senior national team players. So on the U14, U15 boys side, we've had conversations with some of our senior team players, at their homes and whether it's overseas or domestic based players. One thing for us in regards to privacy, definitely comes with how, handling COVID. And I think one thing that we've stressed specifically with privacy is, they need to know the what and the why, but they don't need to know the who. And I think that was super important for us when bringing in a variety of different players from all over the world into camp, and just understanding how important our COVID protocols are, our compliance is. And again, when we disseminate that information, who's on those group chats, and, is it a phone call? Is it a message? Is it an email? And then is it a Zoom call afterwards? So that was super important for us, while also maintaining the privacy of the players.
I love it. You guys have talked about some of the innovations, some of the best practices you've put in place and what you've noticed. I'd love to hear what you've seen from your peers, and maybe Connor, if it's all right, we'll bounce back to you. When you look at other teams across the Premier League or across the world, any best practices, anything that stood out, anyone doing a particularly good job in the communication arena?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, personally myself, before I was at Wolves, I was at Liverpool. I spent 5 years there. So I'm still in regular communications with the staff over there. So it's been good to see how they've managed things and how they've communicated with their players throughout. And something they do very well is hold regular meetings with key members of the playing staff. So whether that's Jordan Henderson, the captain, Virgil van Dijk, there's a key member of the players that they would regularly discuss important topics. So whether that's when the next COVID testing slots will be, or where the next training centre is next going to be around the country, or whether the club are going to incorporate some new changes around the training ground or the stadium. They would then hold meetings with the players to discuss those and what the players feel. Then those key members would then relay that information back to the squad, kind of gather some feedback from the squad, and then come back and discuss those with the exec level people at the club. So I think that's really important, is those regular communication with those key squad members to then get the overall feedback from the club. And something we do at Wolves really well, especially for first team games, given at the moment it's very difficult to introduce an atmosphere at the moment at stadiums. Obviously with no fans there, it's very difficult, and it's a huge factor for us is our home crowd. They make a great noise, so not having them has been difficult. So we've tried to incorporate factors to help our first team squad in terms of, so we put on a light show before the start of the game. We put on the music that the players want to hear. There's kind of fire going on. We've done a lot of things to kind of help the first team squad feel more like it's a first team game, even though the fans aren't there. So things like that we've started to do, and I think we'll definitely look to kind of carry that on moving forward as well.
Yeah, that attention to detail is really impressive, right? All the small things add up and make a big difference. Mike, want to ask you, as I asked Connor about best practices across different teams in the league, has there been discussion, with your peers as a league, as the MLS? Are you guys actively discussing ways to improve and ways to communicate and sharing those best practices? And if so, have you heard any great ones that are worth highlighting?
I was really surprised when I first came into the role I'm in to see how collaborative all the clubs were. I think in most leagues, and you think how competitive this environment is, the idea of sharing information and sharing things like best practices, you would think would be kept close to the vest. And I was really appreciative, especially the team administrators. I think how collaborative they were in trying to share some of these ideas. And I mentioned the fact that we had players in quarantine during the summer in Orlando, and the idea of being isolated. I mean, it literally, you're alone. And I think knowing that there are others there with you that are thinking about you and they're mindful about what you're doing is really important. What we found was, and a lot of the clubs did a really good job of engaging the players during the course of the pandemic, that much more so when our players were in isolation down in Orlando, creating home gyms in each of their homes, in some cases hotel rooms. We were very fortunate with some of our partners that we have here to be able to get exercise bikes, yoga mats, weight equipment to each guy's home. Each player in market here had essentially a home gym created for them. We had, and again, as far as adopting best practices from other clubs, our performance staff, John Ireland, our head performance coach, and Stephen Mason, our strength conditioning coach, they would put on regular workouts with the guys on a daily basis. What was great was doing it on Zoom. You could see each other while you're doing it also. To hold a level of accountability. And again, at a time where you are kind of isolated, I think it's encouraging to kind of be able to see your peers as well, and found that was really beneficial. The other thing I thought for our academy, and dovetailing off something Sam said, so that was really important in regards to looking at best practices around our league as well, finding a way to engage youth players and academy players in our club. The fact that so many of them are so young and immature psychologically and emotionally to go through something like this, even with their home, with their families, to be able to appreciate that what they're going through, everyone's going through it. This pandemic was indiscriminate. No matter what you were doing to be vigilant and take care of yourself, it could still infect you. And I think to have, weekly Zoom calls with senior players from our club, players that they've watched on TV who now kind of came essentially in the living rooms to talk to them, through mediums we were using, I think made it easier to relate to what was happening globally, and brought it home to them when I think, 13, 14, 15-year-old academy players, see senior players used to watching on TV, doing the same things they're doing as far as being home and isolated in their house. And I think probably made a foreign and potentially scary situation, less foreign.
We've gotten a great question here from the audience, and for those listening, I'll remind you, feel free to chime in if there are topics you want to hear the panelists weigh in on. Sam, I'll pitch this one to you. We had an audience member raise, that you all have talked about frequency of communication and having a regular cadence of communication, but they raise potentially the opposite problem. Is there a danger of over communication? And they asked, during the COVID breaks in play, especially, was it hard to find a balance between too much versus not enough contact, and with the players and with the staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to be cognizant of everyone's time, and everyone was going through something different, right? And it was important that we understood that. And I think in our group chat, you can kind of get lost sometimes with people who are naturally going to speak up more and whatnot. I think just the biggest thing was support. When we noticed that there was maybe a little bit of a lull in the group chat, or we had been doing too much, maybe to scale it back a little bit. We do have kind of a working group that meets every Tuesday and Friday that kind of discusses that and goes over that. But I do think that was important. We did find, sometimes when we were trying to say, do something fun and, a little quiz on the group chat, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, by Wednesday, no one was answering. So we scaled that back and started to, better understand that these guys, some of them just want to, enjoy being with their families. One of our players, kind of laughed and was like, this is the first time I've actually been able to cook breakfast, lunch, and dinner and be with my 3 kids the whole time. So understanding that balance was super important. I think a little bit more on the younger side, the engagement had to be there a little bit more. But definitely understand the balance, especially when we started going back into the leagues, when one league started coming up, and then, trickling down all the other ones. It was important to note that these guys are, back in game mode, while some are still at home.
Connor, I want to come to you. We've, I think this has been a challenge raised by society at large, not just in sport, particularly with the pandemic. People spending a ton of time on their phones, right? Lots of screen time, lots of time on Zoom, on other platforms that, maybe even with lockdown regulations in different countries, maybe they don't have the luxury of getting outside for extended periods of time. How have you thought about that from a culture and player welfare, player health perspective, balancing, again, the over communication and frequently staying connected with trying to make sure their physical and mental health is aligned?
Yeah, of course. Sam made a good point there. It's all about the balance, and it's about getting that relevant information to those relevant people, rather than kind of sending information to everyone that's not necessarily relevant to them. So if it's a broadcast message to everyone, making sure that's something you want to kind of feedback from them, or if it's individual people you want to hear back from. So it's reducing that noise at the end of the day, because the key priority for us is making sure the players are ready to perform on the pitch. So we have to do everything we can off the pitch to make sure they're at the highest optimum kind of capacity to perform on the pitch. So no, that's the most important thing for us, is making sure that relevant information is going to the relevant people.
Yeah, and that phrase you use, reducing noise, it's interesting that of all the teams we work with across, every league, every sport across the world, that reducing of noise, reducing of distraction is kind of the common theme, the ultimate goal for positioning players for success on and off the field. Mike, I want to jump to you. Got maybe a potentially challenging question from an audience member. You talked about communicating not just operationally, not just for frequency and visibility, but also for culture and sharing of club values and making sure those are instilled. And with that comes accountability and adherence to those values. So we had an audience member ask, when there is a problem internally, when someone is not acting according to values, when there's a problem that a player has with a manager or a coach or a teammate, what kind of channels are set up? How do you handle that potentially sensitive or private conversation, especially now at distance?
It's a great question, because when this pandemic started, almost a year ago, there was no playbook about how to manage players and staff, via satellite or remote. And, we've all probably created our own, instructions manual or playbook now of how to cope and deal in these settings. And when it comes to those who aren't adhering, we have to appreciate also the fact that, people, how they conduct their own business now, things have changed forever. Some are going to have more challenges coming back to the office as they're used to working remote. Some aren't used to being in close contact and close quarters people, and have concerns with not having vaccines yet. And, for us, I think what we tried to look at was when situations like that occurred, trying to get the stakeholders together and try to see, who's going to be involved from a problem solving standpoint of not only addressing that with staff member or players, but, to what extent do they feel it's compromising at the core values? Having regular check-ins to know people are doing it. The reality is that everyone copes and responds to things differently, and it's unfair to ask everyone to behave in the same fashion, knowing that now you're working out of your house versus being together every day. So for us, we tried to make sure that, there's a famous quote from Ronald Reagan, it's a trust but verify. So the hope is that you're going to empower your players and staff to be able to handle things, independently, whether it's, during a normal work day, when pre-pandemic to working remote. But the reality is, that there's responsibilities not only for each of those individuals who are with your team, but also for your leadership to make sure they're checking in regularly to make sure people are adhering to that.
And, Sam, especially you're asking young players to represent their country at a young age. So I know values alignment is critical for you all as an organization. How do you manage that? How do you bring players into that culture, align them with those values, and then again, how do you hold them accountable to those values as they grow throughout their careers?
Yeah, absolutely, and it definitely is a challenge, right? A good example is when we did create this this group communication at the beginning of this. There were 3 or 4 players that had never been called into camp, and they had never been exposed to what our culture and environment is like in the men's national team. And I think a lot of times, while the technical staff and the organization staff can preach how everything runs and how our culture is, we relied a lot on our senior team players. And that responsibility, I think they did a good job of taking on and understanding, this is their role. They've been in the shoes of a 17, 18, 19-year-old who's gotten their first cap with the men's national team. And so having, those connections, I think were super important. I think it was super positive how those more senior players did interact with the younger ones. And again, it's all about an engagement and starting it from the beginning. I think it starts with our head coach, Greg, and kind of goes all the way down. But it's definitely difficult creating a culture through a WhatsApp group. That's definitely a challenge. I think one of the consequences of, being with the national team is just time with the guys. We have, limited time rather than in a club environment. So we need to hound home those as almost as quickly as possible and try and instill those as quickly as we can. Fortunately, we have those senior players that have been through it and lead by example.
And, Connor, for you all, part of your values alignment, part of your values development is connecting the first team all the way down to the academy and making sure that there's a consistent experience, a consistent culture. Again, with folks separated, with different challenges at play. Have you found creative ways to do that to, instill in the youth players the values you want them to have as they rise up through the ranks?
Yeah, of course. It's massive that we have those values from top to bottom throughout the club, whether that's be our star striker or an under 9 through the academy. Those boys down at the academy level need to know what it's like and what's needed to make it at first team level. So we do have kind of regular communication with our players. Connor Cody, our captain, did a group chat, a Zoom chat with all our academy, where he answered a number of questions from each of the players to kind of ask a number of things, how he was dealing with the pandemic, along the lines of also what it's like to play in the first team and some of the biggest games he's played and things like that. So kind of bridging that gap between academy and first team can be difficult at other clubs, because sometimes we're on different sites and there's not that regular communication. With us, thankfully at Wolves, everyone's on the same site, everyone's on the same page. The message from the manager is together stronger. That's our kind of team motto, and that's been more important than ever in the current situation. So as long as everyone throughout the academy and the club knows that the manager is installing those values, it's vitally important to them as well.
Well, I think what you bring up about connecting the players is critical, right? As I think about the teams that we work with, the healthiest cultures that I see are the ones where the players are enforcing the culture, right? They're holding each other accountable, and it's not just top down from the sporting director, from the manager, from whoever else in a position of power on the staff. It's ingrained. Everybody lives by it, and so being able to find creative ways to expand that during the pandemic is awesome, and great work on you all. I want to ask you guys a little bit of a challenge question here, and Mike, I'll come to you first. I want to hear what went wrong, right? We've talked about best practices and good ideas and good innovations, but surely you had ideas that fell flat on their face, or as you've looked at other teams, and I won't ask you to name names, but where have you seen communication break down or some of those challenges not be able to be met?
The biggest ones probably come from the idea of telephone tag. And, I think about information being disseminated. How do your players or staff hear from it? Are they hearing from it from the club's leadership for the first time? Are they hearing about it from the media for the first time? Are they hearing about it from, a friend or former teammate in a different team that's trickled down? When it comes to our league, players, learn information from their teammates, from friends on different teams, from the players union. For us as a club, we hear about things from our league office. We heard about things, from, I think about during the pandemic, from league staff, that were down there. And for us, we want to make sure that anything our players heard, our staff heard, they heard from us first. That there's a level of trust and equity built in relationships. And the hope was that they were going to hear information from us. And, I tried to kind of stress early on that unless you heard it from us first, it wasn't true. And, I think the reality is that, sometimes you think about like the idea of telephone tag, what the initial message is, when it finally gets to people, it can get twisted and turned sometimes. So I think it's important to make sure that there's clarity in the message you have. And I think sometimes, Sam mentioned earlier about, learning things as you go. Maybe you start out doing things a certain number of times a day and you scale back. We found was, early on, maybe in that process, waiting too late in the day, too many other things can happen and too many other people can kind of interject before hearing about it from you first. And where you want to respect, especially for players, opportunity to sleep long enough that their bodies recover from the day prior. I think trying to do it early enough so that the first time the players were hearing the information was from us ended up being really helpful.
And Connor, we'll go to you and then to Sam. Same question. What pitfalls or dangers should the audience members be thinking about or watching out for in their organizations?
Yeah, I think the big challenge for us is when they're in this bubble. It's kind of they're in the environment where they're not necessarily knowing everything else that's going on around them in the outside world. So it's just making sure we're educating the players so they know exactly what they can and can't do. Because in the UK, it's been well known, we've been in a number of lockdowns during this pandemic. So rules have been pretty strict in what people can and can't do outside. So it's making sure the players are aware of that and they're not breaking those rules, because obviously they've got fans from the outside looking in and making sure that these guys are adhering to the rules. And if they're not, they're obviously held accountable. So it's making sure we're keeping them educated. That's the big thing. That's the biggest challenge, and making sure they're adhering to those rules. So that was probably the biggest challenge throughout.
Sam, how about you?
Yeah, I'll piggyback on a little bit what Connor said. I think one challenge that we faced in our first camp was, our return to play protocols for our federation were very strict, and it was something that the players that we had come in, they were already used to the return to play in their leagues. So it was difficult to instill what our federation was doing. And, we had to hammer home why we were doing it. And a lot of it was just education. It was important that all the information funneled down from us only, and they weren't reading about it, on social media or anything like that. So that the education piece was huge. We did a lot of Zoom calls prior to our arrival into camp, and that we've continued to do. It was funny. One of them, the first one wasn't mandatory, and then we realized very, very quickly that it should have been mandatory because a lot of the individuals weren't on that call, which really just gave the lay of the land of what camp environment was going to look like. So that was super important. And then again, I think what Mike said, just understanding that the information that you hear has to come through us first, because there's so many outside channels that they're getting information from.
I want to hit you guys with kind of one other topic around communication. We've talked a lot about the players, the staff inside the club walls, but like you say, Sam, there's a lot of other channels, a lot of other, sometimes potential distractions, but sometimes key stakeholders that are a part of the players' lives that need to be informed. I would love to hear from you all how you've managed communication, or if you've managed communication with some of those outside parties, in particular players' partners, parents potentially, even agents or professional third-party contacts. Sam, I'll stick with you for this one, but that kind of next layer of communication, how have you addressed it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was actually something that we included on these mandatory Zoom calls prior to camp, is we invited the family members of our players and our staff. And I think, a lot of our staff actually had their partners on with questions. We have 3 or 4 of our staff members who have young kids. And while we have this controlled environment while we're in camp, leaving that controlled environment back to their household, they wanted to ensure that it was just as controlled as it was when we were inside. So we had those conversations a lot with, the wives of all of our staff members, and understanding that when they go home back to their 2-year-old, that, they're safe and they're healthy, and how we're going to do that. So that one was really important. And that was just, again, including them in this culture that we're creating, right? We're all in this together, including, those individuals outside of our actual player pool and technical staff.
And Mike, and then Connor, how do you think about that? And not just during pandemic times, but what's kind of your strategy around that next layer of communication?
You look at the role that guys like Connor and Sam play at their clubs. For us, our administration department is vital for that connectivity. And, we have in our administration department a player care manager, Erin Mishu, who is responsible really from the second that we acquire a player via transfer, via loan, through the draft, to help that person when they first arrive, help them get settled in our market, and whether that's helping them find a home, a bank account, if they're international, social security number, to making sure that once they settle, that their families settle as well. There's the old adage, like, if mama's not happy, like, nobody's happy. So for us, it's an expansion team this last year where we had 30 new players, descend into Nashville. The hope for us was to make sure that before we started our preseason, that each of those players, not only did they have a home set up and their payroll set up, but that their partners were also settled. And whether that was helping them get acclimated, helping them with employment, they needed assistance with that. The idea of making sure that the partners, spouses, their children, that they were settled as well. And I think Erin's done a really good job of helping that connectivity. And you see it on match day when families turn up, and they're in the lounge after a game. You see it in general when it comes to things like Zoom calls, and you see, spouses and children involved as well. And again, I think when the families are happy, there's less distractions for the players. You mentioned, before, as a kind of a theme about trying to cut down the noise around what happens. And to me, I think if families are settled, then the players can concentrate on football.
Mm-hmm. Connor, anything different, or would you echo similar?
Similar to what Mike said. So yeah, we also have a player care team, and we obviously have an international squad of players. So our players come from all over the world. So it's vitally important when they come to Wolverhampton, we make them feel as settled and as part of the family as possible. And that goes all the way to arranging language lessons for children and family members, because you don't want them coming to a new country and being isolated and not knowing the language. So we'll go all the way to making sure they feel as welcome as possible, and have that direct communication with the families, and like Mike said, getting them on board and getting them into games, getting them watching the matches, and having that family feel, not just when they're at home, but when they're at the club as well, and feeling part of the family is massively important. So we do that very well.
Absolutely. As we wrap up and get toward the end of our session here, one, I want to thank again each of you for participating and joining and sharing wisdom and experience with us, and again to the folks at SoccerX and all who helped put this on, and to my colleagues at Teamworks who have worked hard to make this panel possible. Just want to send a big thank you. I want to give you each a final word in the last minute, and maybe 10-15 seconds each. The last bullet point or two that you would offer as a takeaway. If you're summarizing the session for the person putting the final notes in the audience in their notebooks before we wrap up, Connor, Sam, and then Mike, I'll give you the final word. What would you say?
Yeah, I would just say, similar to what our motto is everyone together is stronger. So it's just having that mentality that as a pack we're better. So just maintaining that for everyone's organisation rather than being individuals. We're much better as a team.
Yeah, I think for me is, keeping positive. It's important that the leadership groups and the technical staff are continuing to be as positive as possible, because there will be challenges. And then just one of our guiding principles as a staff is have a plan and make a better plan. I don't think that's been more apparent in all these camps that we've been a part of.
At a time where so many of us are working remote, being able to use resources like Teamworks, like WhatsApp, like Zoom calls to create connectivity at a time like this is as important as ever.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you to all of you. Thank you to the folks at SoccerX. We will send it right back to the studio.